I knew something was wrong the moment my son didn't offer me a chair. It sounds small, almost silly, but when you've raised a child, you learn the language of their silences long before they open their mouth. We were standing in the living room, my living room, the one I had painted myself years ago, choosing a soft color because it made the evenings calmer. His wife was sitting, my grandson was sitting, and I was standing. That's when he said it, not loudly, not angrily, almost professionally. Either serve my wife and son or leave the house. For a second, the room felt unreal, like I'd stepped out of my own life and was watching a scene play out from the corner of the ceiling. Serve. That was the word that echoed in my chest. Not respect, not adjust, not even compromise. Serve. I looked at my son, the boy whose school lunches I packed with notes, the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys. And I realized something in that moment that most people realize too late. He wasn't talking to his mother. He was talking to an obstacle. His wife didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on her phone, scrolling slowly, calmly, as if this conversation had already been approved. My grandson copied her silence, and suddenly everything became very clear. This wasn't a fight, it was a verdict. Most people think betrayal comes with shouting, with slammed doors and raised voices, but the real ones, they come dressed as decisions already made. I didn't ask questions. I didn't remind him of sacrifices. I didn't say, "I'm your mother." Because when someone reduces you to a choice, you don't beg to be chosen, you choose yourself. So I smiled. That smile confused him. I saw it in his eyes, just for a split second. I walked to the bedroom, the same room where I had slept lightly for years, always alert to footsteps, coughs, late-night worries. I opened my closet and took out my bag, not in a rush, not shaking, calm. I folded exactly what I needed, nothing more. I didn't take photos. I didn't take memories. I took only what belonged to me, legally, emotionally, spiritually. When I came back into the living room, they were waiting. He expected tears or anger or an apology. Instead, I lifted my bag onto my shoulder. "I understand," I said. That was it. No drama, no explanation. I walked past him, past his wife, past my grandson, who finally looked up confused, sensing that something permanent had just happened. At the door, my son spoke again. "You're really leaving?" I turned back, and for the first time that evening, I looked directly at his wife. "I already left," I said. The door closed softly behind me. No slamming, no final words, just silence. People love to imagine that the power ends when a woman walks out. They're wrong. What they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that I had been preparing for years, not for revenge, for reality. I had learned long ago that love without respect turns into leverage, and I never allowed myself to be leveraged. The bank accounts that were just paperwork, the documents I was told not to worry about, the favors done quietly, the names I had kept clean, all of it mattered, and all of it was already in motion. That first night I stayed somewhere simple, quiet, clean. I slept better than I had in months. No one called, not that night, not the next day, and that told me everything. Because when people think you're weak, they don't chase you. They wait for you to come back. They wait for hunger, for guilt, for fear. They underestimate silence. A week passed, then 2, still nothing. I went about my days calmly, handled what needed handling, signed what needed signing. I didn't announce anything. I didn't threaten anything. I simply allowed consequences to continue unfolding exactly as they were meant to. By the 3rd week, I heard through someone else that my son was stressed. By the fourth, that stress had a name, and by the end of the month, my phone rang. Once, twice, 5 times, 10. I didn't answer, because when someone tells you to serve or leave, they don't decide when the conversation resumes. By the time the calls reached 30, finally he understood something he should have learned much earlier. I hadn't left the house. I had removed the foundation. The first few days after I left my son's house were quieter than I expected. Too quiet, almost like the world was holding its breath. I woke up in my small rented apartment, sunlight spilling across the wooden floors. I made tea the way I had always done, carefully, with measured hands, stirring the leaves just enough to release their aroma. It felt almost ritualistic, ordinary, and yet nothing about this moment was ordinary. I thought about him, my son, and the audacity it took for him to draw a line like that. Serve or leave. I let the word echo again in my mind, not out of anger, but for context, for clarity, for patience. Because revenge isn't about heat, it's about timing. And timing, I had learned long ago, is not something you rush. By the end of the first week, I started hearing little things through the grapevine. A neighbor mentioned he had tried to get rid of a few old papers I had left behind, files I had quietly arranged years ago. Documents, letters, contracts, little reminders that I had kept everything in order, even if no one had appreciated it. He thought that would intimidate me. It didn't. It amused me. I had a plan, and it wasn't reactive. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about letting his choices unravel on their own, the way a poorly stitched dress falls apart when tugged in the wrong direction. One morning, I received a text from his wife. A simple, "Mom, can we talk?" No apology, no guilt, just words hanging in the middle of an empty line, waiting for me to grab them. I didn't respond. Not yet. Because words without accountability are empty, and she, just like him, had no idea what was already in motion. Instead, I began to focus on myself, not as the mother they had wronged, but as the woman they had underestimated. I went through my old accounts, my contacts, the quiet assets I had maintained for years. I didn't touch everything, just enough to remind myself that power, real power, is often invisible. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand attention, it waits. By the second week, I heard about the tension at his home. A friend called casually. "Your son, he's been irritable. Everything seems to be falling apart." I smiled to myself. I didn't need to ask for details. He was feeling the first consequences of his choice, not from me, not directly. From the structure I had built quietly over decades, from the responsibilities he had ignored, from the life he thought he could dominate. Meanwhile, my grandson, sweet, quiet boy, occasionally called my phone. I didn't refuse him, but I also didn't rush. I listened, and when he said, "Grandma, I miss you," I simply replied, "I know, sweetheart. I know." No lectures, no manipulations, just presence and patience. By the third week, the calls began. The 30 calls, the ones that would eventually break him. I didn't answer the first few, or the first 10, or even 20, but I listened to the messages. His voice was trembling, each call more desperate than the last, each word carefully crafted, trying to manipulate, to guilt, to bargain, all the while unaware that his efforts were irrelevant. Because I wasn't coming back. I wasn't negotiating. I was letting the consequences of his own arrogance fall where they belonged. He called again at night, this time crying, begging me to forget everything, promising change, swearing he would make things right. I put the phone down and sat in silence. I let the sound of his desperation fade into the background. I didn't need to respond. He had already made his choice. And yet, I was not cruel. I was meticulous. I was careful. Each step I had taken, from leaving quietly to managing my resources to letting him feel the first ripple of consequences, was deliberate. I began to reclaim small pieces of myself. A painting I had wanted to finish years ago, letters I had never sent, the garden outside my window, which I tended daily. Life that was mine, not theirs. It was in this calm that I realized something profound. Revenge doesn't need theatrics. It doesn't need screaming. It doesn't need confrontation. It needs control. The kind of control that lets the universe and the choices of those who wronged you unfold naturally. And as I watered the plants one evening, the sun low in the sky casting a warm glow across my apartment, I allowed a quiet thought to settle in my chest. The storm hadn't even started yet. By the time the third week ended, the cracks had started to show. Not loudly, not with explosions, but with the subtle, terrifying sounds of a life unraveling. I watched from a distance, quietly, calmly, as the son who had once demanded obedience began to stumble in ways he hadn't anticipated. His job calls, the ones he had always handled with arrogance, started piling up. Mistakes he would normally have brushed off were magnified. Projects delayed, emails unanswered, clients irritated. Each oversight a reminder that competence is never inherited, it is earned, and he had spent too long believing it was automatic. His wife, too, had begun to show cracks. I didn't need to speak to her. Whispers traveled faster than messages. People noticed the shift. Friends began commenting on her stress. Her eyes no longer carried the calm arrogance that had once made me feel invisible in my own home. The first time he called after the 15th attempt, his voice shook in a way that made my chest tighten, not with anger, but with satisfaction tempered with restraint. Mom, please, can we just talk? I let it ring. Twice. 3 times, because begging only works when the beggar has leverage, and he had none. I began to notice small, almost trivial things that would have gone unnoticed before. The way his son, my grandson, looked up when I wasn't around, as if sensing the tension but not understanding it. The way their house had lost its warmth, the laughter gone, replaced by silence and careful avoidance. The way he hesitated before making any decision, always wondering if it would be another mistake. And it was glorious in its quiet, relentless inevitability. I didn't take credit, of course. I didn't gloat to anyone. I simply allowed the natural consequences of his arrogance to unfold. Years of entitlement, years of dismissing me, years of ignoring the woman who had carried him through childhood, all of it began to collapse. By the 4th week, the calls became frantic, not polite requests, not gentle nudges, but desperate, raw, almost pleading sounds that would have once embarrassed him to his core. I can't. I'm sorry. Please, Mom. Each word felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of his ego. And yet I still didn't respond, because responding would have been participation, and I had removed myself from participation the moment he demanded obedience instead of respect. Instead, I continued to build myself in ways he had never considered. I visited old friends, people who had always valued me, but who had been pushed aside when my life became secondary to theirs. I handled my finances with precision, ensuring that every document, every account, every asset was exactly where it needed to be, untouchable, secure, mine. I planned dinners, walks, quiet evenings, not for anyone's approval, but because I finally had the space to be fully, unapologetically myself. One evening, I received a message from my grandson. "Grandma, can we come see you?" I paused before replying, not out of malice, but to remind myself that relationships built on respect, not convenience, take patience. I wrote, "Yes." A single word, no condition, no guilt. The day they arrived, the tension was palpable. I greeted my grandson first, smiling as if nothing had happened. He clung to me briefly, then looked at his mother and father, searching for guidance, unsure how to navigate this new version of reality. And then I saw it, the fear masked as hesitation in my son's eyes. He realized at last that I wasn't going to beg, I wasn't going to plead, I wasn't going to return because he decided it was convenient. The power of his choice was gone. He could see it now, like a shadow creeping over his carefully constructed life. That night I prepared dinner, simple, quiet, unpretentious. No fanfare, no lecture, just presence. He tried to initiate conversation, stumbling over words, desperate to regain a foothold. I listened. Occasionally I nodded. I answered questions when necessary, but I never gave more than I owed. Because influence is not about proximity, it's about control, and I had reclaimed mine. After they left, I sat by the window watching the street glow under the yellow lamplight. I allowed myself a small smile, not of cruelty, but of recognition. The son who had demanded obedience now realized that respect is not something you can order, it is earned, and when it is withdrawn, it does not return easily. And for the first time in months, I felt fully free. The calls continued, of course, 30 in total, each more desperate than the last. He begged, promised, swore, and threatened in subtle ways. None of it mattered. Because I wasn't reacting, I wasn't bargaining, I wasn't negotiating. I was waiting, watching, knowing that the universe and the choices people make in it had a way of balancing itself. And slowly, inevitably, they began to understand what I had already known. You cannot reduce someone to a choice and expect them to remain small. You cannot demand loyalty without respect and think it will come quietly. And you can underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has spent decades building themselves, not for anyone else, but for reality. The walls around his arrogance were closing in, and there was nothing he could do about it. By the 5th week, I had become a quiet storm. Every call, every text, every attempt at manipulation from my son and his wife only reinforced the truth. I was untouchable. Not because I sought vengeance, but because I had never allowed myself to be manipulated. They didn't understand that power doesn't roar, it waits, it observes, it moves when the time is right. It started with the calls, each one a testament to his desperation. By this point, I didn't listen to the words anymore. I listened to the rhythm of his panic, the desperation leaking through every syllable. "Please, Mom, forgive me." Each plea was weaker than the last, but louder in consequence. I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. He had already lost the leverage he thought he had. He had already chosen his path, and the universe, with my quiet guidance, was enforcing the price. Then came the first real acknowledgement of the damage he had done to himself. A mutual friend, someone he had always relied on to smooth over his mistakes, called me. He's falling apart, really. Everything's spinning. He doesn't know what to do next. I nodded politely over the phone, though no one could see me. I had done nothing aggressive, no confrontation, no threats, just patience, observation, and meticulous preparation. A week later, I visited my grandson, alone. The boy ran into my arms, tears brimming in his eyes. "Grandma, I don't understand. Why?" I held him tightly, letting him release the fear and confusion he had carried silently. He wasn't responsible for their arrogance. He had been raised in a house where respect was conditional, but with me, he was safe. He could breathe. And that, more than anything, became my quiet satisfaction. The calls became frantic after that, twice a day, 3 times a day, each attempt more pathetic than the last. I listened to snippets occasionally. "Please, I'll do anything. I'm begging you. Forget everything." He had no idea. He had no idea that what he was asking me to forget had already been cemented. The foundation I had quietly built, the assets, the documents, the arrangements, was untouchable. His world had begun to crumble from the moment I walked out, and now there was nothing left to save. Then came the day he showed up at my door, alone, trembling, defeated. I opened it, calm, steady, collected. He began. I held up my hand. "Don't. Not a word," I said softly. He looked at me, eyes wide, realizing fully for the first time that the woman he had thought powerless was in reality untouchable. Not a tear, not a word of guilt, not a plea, nothing. I don't know what to do," he whispered. And in that instant, he understood. This wasn't about me returning. This wasn't about apologies. This was about respect, something he had taken for granted his entire life, and it was gone. I nodded once. That was all he needed. The silence said everything. By the time he left, it was clear. He had lost control. His wife had lost confidence. Even my grandson looked up to me now, not just as a grandmother, but as someone who could see the truth and act accordingly. Later that night, I sat by my window, the city lights casting soft shadows across my living room. I felt calm. I felt powerful, not because I had punished them, but because I had let reality do the work. Revenge, I realized, is often less about the act and more about the understanding. When someone chooses arrogance over respect, they will inevitably face the consequences. And if you allow yourself to be wise, prepared, and untouchable, you needn't lift a finger. The universe, combined with decades of silent preparation, does the rest. By the next week, the calls stopped. He had finally learned the lesson he had refused to understand. You cannot demand obedience. You cannot erase decades of influence and love without consequence. And you certainly cannot underestimate someone who has spent years building herself, quietly, patiently, wisely. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't gloat. I simply continued my life. Painting, writing, tending my little garden, nurturing my relationships with those who mattered, at finally peace. The storm had passed, the damage had been done, and in the quiet aftermath, I realized that true strength lies not in confrontation, not in shouting, not in dramatic revenge. It lies in silence, patience, and inevitability. The door that my son had closed in arrogance had reopened. Not because I allowed him back in, but because he finally saw the woman he had dismissed as powerless, and it was too late. I had already left in every way that mattered, and that, at last, was enough. Did this story shock you as much as it shocked them? If you felt every twist and turn, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. And I want to hear from you. Comment below and tell me what you would have done if you were in her shoes.